I'm thrilled to be here with Jay Hakes, who is an author and historian, particularly on energy and presidential politics, to talk through taking the long view on the energy technologies we need, or really anything else we decide to talk about for the next hour. Let me give you a little bit of a background on Jay. Started his life in academia, Duke University, where your PhD was in
African politics.
African politics, professor at the University of New Orleans, so not born here, but like a lot of us, got here as soon as he could. Chief of Staff to Florida U.S. Senator Bob Graham and then Governor Bob Graham. Member of the Carter administration, administrator of the U.S. Energy Information Administration, which some of you may know what that is. As a former oil and gas reporter, I have spent many, many days, probably a sign of a misspent youth, digging through the data and figures that really is the essential compendium of the oil and gas industry on a daily, weekly, monthly basis. Ran that from 1993 to 2000. Director of the Jimmy Carter Presidential Library, and served as a leader on the National Commission on the BP Deepwater Horizon oil spill. He is an author of 3 books, or maybe more, if I'm... Three, good, got the number right. A Declaration of Energy Independence, How Freedom from Foreign Oil Can Improve National Security, Our Economy, and the Environment. Energy Crises, Nixon, Ford, Carter, and the Hard Choices of the 1970s. And most recently, The Presidents and the Planet, Climate Change Science and Politics from Eisenhower to Bush. So thank you, Jay, for being here. Want to spend some time today just walking people through your book, and then a whole bunch of other topics. Of course, when you have a presidential historian a week after an election, I'm sure we'll have some time to discuss that and the implications for energy policy as well. But your book, first of all, I thought it was fantastic.
Thank you.
It was laying out really the way that academia, public policy, the media, technology sort of intersects, runs through the White House, runs through the places of power within the U.S., and how that's translated into the way that we've addressed climate change, or the way that we haven't addressed climate change over the past decades, and provides us with what I think is a really great long view of this industry and this issue. And you know, for a history lesson, incredibly timely, because we're in the middle of a period of rapid change in the energy industry, sort of necessitated by decisions made for decades. But this period of rapid change is probably going to last for decades as well. And so the decisions we're making now will reverberate. And so the thing that, you know, I want to ask you, you know, first off, you know, related to your book, you know, I guess there's a sense, I think, that if I walked out onto St. Charles Avenue right now and said, you know, what did policymakers over the years and decades, what did they do with climate change? I think a lot of people would say, well, they knew it was coming and they didn't do much, which, you know, is not really true, right? You know, at least in the early decades that you cover in this book. So maybe we start there, because, and we can talk a little bit about the things that you uncovered about how science, at least in those early years in Eisenhower, and then on, kind of made its way from academia through into public policy.
Yeah, I think that's an excellent start, because I kind of resist the comment that we've done nothing to deal with climate change. So my approach would be to say we haven't done enough, but we've done something. Because if you say we haven't done something, you just kind of get like the deer in the headlights, and you sort of give up. So things are changing fast right now, but it's important to realize that they are changing because of things that were done many decades ago. And when I started my book, I wasn't going to start in the 1950s. But when you get in the late 50s, right within several years of each other, Roger Revelle writes the early pioneering stories on or articles about climate science. And he says this is where humans are performing an experiment on the planet, and we better pay attention. So about the same time, we open our first civilian nuclear power plant. And Revelle says in a sentence that's been overlooked, but if we have all nuclear by the 20th century, which is what the Atomic Energy Commission thought, this won't be a problem. About the same time, Bell Labs says, well, photovoltaic collectors will work a lot better if we get rid of vacuum tubes and use transistors using silicon. And a little bit later, in the Ford administration, we start working on the technology that produced the oil and gas revolution, which was hydraulic fracturing combined with horizontal drilling and microseismology. So that really starts in the 70s. So to understand where we are today, we have to realize the timeframes that are involved. And the timeframes are really important on climate change because carbon stays in the atmosphere for more than 100 years.
Yeah, I've heard you speak elsewhere, Jay, and the thing that I have often found compelling is that you stress that the advances in technology, whether that's nuclear, whether that's PV, whether that's wind, it's really only one part of this, right? I'd love for you to tell the folks here a little bit about the 4 tracks that you were looking through in your book, whether it be technology, public policy, et cetera.
Okay. Well, part of it is what science says, and there's been several breakthroughs in the science. One, I didn't start back then, but in 1856, a scientist finds that carbon dioxide traps heat. And that may explain why we had the ice age and heating of the planet from natural causes. That scientist was Eunice Foote of upstate New York, a woman who published her article in the Journal of the American Association for the Advancement of Science and then got forgotten about for about 120 years. But then Roger Revelle comes along in 1955 and says, I'm an oceanographer. He is maybe the world's leading oceanography. And he said, because of the chemistry of water, it cannot accept all the carbon dioxide that humans are putting into the atmosphere. And so the assumption of most scientists at that time, until Revelle came along, was the Earth was in a state of equilibrium. And he said, well, it's not. And he provided the money for Dave Keeling, who was a young scientist who was obsessed with measuring carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, and Keeling hired him to work at the Scripps Institution, which is now part of the University of California, San Diego. And so the two of them transformed the science. And so Revelle says Keeling says at the time, for the rest of the century, this is going to be models. What we're explaining is going to happen as a result of this. We won't actually see the results of climate change with our own eyes until the next century. And we probably should act now, but we may not. So that's one track. Another track is how the political system deals with it. And I do there's a lot of surprises in here. I resurrect and honor John Chafee, a Republican senator from Rhode Island, who was a real pioneer in doing something about climate politically. And then I look at the economists. I don't talk about it too much in my public oral presentations because it's a little bit complicated. I try not to be too much of a policy nerd in this book. It's written for a general audience. But how the economists have entered into this, and then technology, which probably we'll focus on more today because that's what the conference is about. So I'm very interested in how solar progressed and how nuclear progressed and what roadblocks did they face along the way, because I think if we learn how we got to where we are today, we'll have a better idea of how to get to where we want to go tomorrow.
Well, tell me a little bit about, go back to Keeling and Revelle for a second. How did those early studies first make their way into the White House?
Well, it's mainly because of Revell. Revell was basically the government's chief oceanographer during World War II. He actually held the naval rank of commander. And he was tied into all the scientists in the Eisenhower White House and the Kennedy White House. And so he was actually invited to a fairly small state dinner with President Eisenhower. And he was about the only academic that was there. He testified before Congress on several occasions. He was head of the International Geological Year. People my age will remember that from the 1950s. It's a really big deal. So he had access at the White House. And so I'm going through Revell's papers, and I thought there was nothing that Kennedy had done. So I'm finding in Revell's papers that the Kennedy speechwriting staff writes him to say, "Thank you for your help on President Kennedy's speech in March of 1961. I thought, man, I better go look at that speech again. And basically what what Kennedy is saying is what Revell has said in his article, that we needed to pay attention to the interaction between the oceans and the atmosphere because that would affect our climate. And Kennedy did that 3 times. The last time he was in academic garb before the National Academy of Sciences, and sitting behind him is Roger Revell. Until my book came out, I think there was zero understanding that the climate change was very well understood at the Kennedy White House by Gordon MacDonald was working there at the time, who later became a famous climate change scientist. So it's just moving the whole time frame backwards from where we thought it was. A lot of people say, well, it never came to the attention of public officials till James Hansen's testimony in 1988. Well, that's just not true.
And it's interesting, particularly in those early years, how that awareness of the issue ends up translating to policy prescription. I mean, I think the notable thing that I took away is, as you see Revell in the background of these speeches with Kennedy, and then Johnson takes office, wants to act on the environment, wants to pass and moves forward with the Clean Air Act. And yet the mention of climate sort of falls out of favor to the idea of something that's maybe more tangible for a voter or a constituent, pollutants, particulate matter. What was happening there in terms of how an administration translates that policy prescription into something that they're going to pass? Because it seemed like that point, at least, was an early pivotal one, demonstrating how hard it is, maybe, for policymakers to get behind something that maybe is generational in nature.
Right. Climate change is a hard problem because if you passed a dramatic policy today, you wouldn't notice it in the temperature or the accumulation levels in the atmosphere very much at all. So you're really trying to change them 10 years out, 20 years out. And Revell, this great scientist that we were talking about, in a private interview one time, he says, well, what are the poor politicians supposed to do? They're up for election in 2 years, and they're dealing with a problem where what they do right or wrong will become evident, decades from now. So it's a political problem. So to be more concrete, in the Johnson era, they hadn't passed the Clean Air Act yet, and Lady Bird Johnson had her beautification program. So again, those of my generation, we remember driving through Gary, Indiana, and Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, and all sorts of places in Texas where they had refineries. And the air was so dark and dirty, And cars weren't air conditioned at the time. So they had to deal with that problem. And so climate change kind of got pushed off the side. The one group at the Johnson White House who didn't want to push it aside was the Atomic Energy Commission, because they realized that they were in a battle with coal. And if you didn't have climate change as part of the calculation, coal came out cheaper. If you had it as part of the calculation, maybe it would turn out differently. But another factor, which I think is implied in your question, is that they were very aware of the Clean Air Act when the Clean Air of climate change when the Clean Air Act was passed in 1970. The Supreme Court seems to be surprised by that or not believe it, but the documents are the documents. It's mentioned very clearly in the testimony. It's actually mentioned in the language of the act, and an academic has gone up to Muskie's. Muskie was sort of the father of the Clean Air Act. Up to his papers, she hasn't published the peer review article yet, but it'll come out. And there's all sorts of climate change stuff in there. And Revell, because of his influence, he knew Muskie quite well. So the pieces start to be put together. It starts to get more difficult when people say, hey, this is a little more difficult than the other pollutants because it involves the whole energy system. The energy system is built on fossil fuels. You can't just push a button and all of a sudden a week from now it's different. Tremendous economic implications. Now, my view is that means you got to start earlier, but it can be interpreted different ways. Yeah,
and some of those moments, right, they become kind of pivotal moments throughout this history of it. I thought when I was reading your book, it reminded me of a book that came out a few years ago, which is Nathaniel Rich's Losing Earth, where he looked at, I think, a smaller time frame, but kind of in the late 80s to the early 90s, where there was sort of a momentum or a potential momentum to make some larger changes that would have set us on a different course today. So zeroed in on one of those pivotal moments. I'm curious, you took a slightly longer time frame. Are there a few pivotal moments that you saw over those decades from Eisenhower to Bush where you would say, that was a moment. That was a moment where a couple policymakers in a room decided it's not the right time to do this. It's not the moment to sort of step in for all of the other exigencies that policymakers have to think about.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned Nathaniel Rich. He and I had lunch together yesterday. He's another author from New Orleans who's written about climate change, and he also writes for the New York Times Magazine, so people pay a lot of attention to what he says. And he's also incidentally teaching a course in environmental history at Tulane this semester. I just found that out yesterday, so if there are any students in the audience, you need to sign up for the class the next time it's offered. But anyhow, I would say one of these tipping points is in the late 1980s. And what makes it a tipping point is we had passed the Clean Air Act. And we also, the United States took the leadership in the protection of the ozone layer. And that was a pretty big deal. It was an international agreement. And during that same period, the US government led in the establishment of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which created an international forum to deal with climate change issues. So this was a real sign of momentum. And one of the things behind it was, in the Senate, there was a very solid environmental coalition that crossed parties. And a lot of times they differed with the White House. And when they would send the letters to the White House, if it had 12 Democrats on it, it'd have 12 Republicans. This was very intentional. So everything that was coming was bipartisan. And the leader on the Republican side, the leaders on the Democratic side were basically Al Gore and Tim Wirth. On the Republican side, it was John Chafee. And if you look at what John Chafee was suggesting, it was more aggressive than what Al Gore was suggesting. So this is where Nathaniel and I really agree that there seemed to be some momentum in the late 1980s, even though President Reagan wasn't necessarily supporting these things with a lot of enthusiasm, he was going along because he didn't want to be vetoed on the floor of the Senate. So, excuse me, he didn't want his veto to be overridden on the floor of the Senate. That coalition fell apart during the administration of Bush 41 with John Sununu as his chief of staff. And that's a whole story that we can get into, how that coalition started to fall apart soon after Reagan left office.
Yeah, well, I mean, we can get into that. You know, I would love to just go back, though, for 1 second, because as we're going through this, the political changes through these periods, what's happening on the same track as the technologies, right? And so we have these periods through which, you know, particularly in Bell Labs, they start experimenting with photovoltaics, and I might get that wrong, but you know, we're starting to see that experimentation. We're starting to see some efficiencies grow. We see the rise of nuclear, and like you said, Revell had this idea that, well, if this technology stays on the same track, in 2000, we might be all right. Things might be fine. And yet, and so walk us through during this time period, maybe leading up to that, and then let's get back to the Sununu discussion. You know, where were we with some of these technologies? How had we been seeing those efficiencies grow? Where did they start to falter?
Okay. Well, putting our minds back in the 1980s, that was a troubled time for the nuclear industry. By that time, there were still a few plants to be completed, but there hadn't been new orders since even before the 3 Mile Island accident. And so the Office of Technological Assessment, which no longer exists, but it was a technical body that advised the Congress, did a sort of a special study on the future of the nuclear industry. And at the time, I was the energy director of the state of Florida, and I was an advisor to the group. And so what we recommended was that the industry go with the smaller nuclear plants that would be modular in construction to prevent the delays in construction, instead of, say, building 5,000 megawatt plants, if you build 200 megawatt plants, then you're building 50. So you can maybe mass produce the parts and then bring them to the site, which would cut costs, financing, et cetera. I would venture to say that that recommendation was not followed. And yet it appears again in White House documents. They're always saying, well, the future is to do this and do this. And yet when we did the Vogtle plants in Georgia, we went back to the gigantic plants again. So, and during this period, photovoltaics are making immense technical progress, but it's not noticed because it's still not market competitive. It was so expensive in the 50s that you couldn't do it, and people were still thinking in terms of the thermal collectors, which was a whole old-fashioned technology. So PV is progressing, but you hardly notice it. So a lot of the emphasis was on energy efficiency. And under Reagan, the first effective appliance efficiency standards were passed under Ronald Reagan. I had a hard, Carter people yell at me when I say that. But so there's that's where the emphasis was at that time on energy efficiency technologies. And so we started making refrigerators and air conditioners that were more efficient. And that's why I say we haven't made enough progress, but if we hadn't had those appliance efficiency standards updated between then and now, we'd be in worse shape than we are now.
Yeah. One of the things that I found compelling, and that I'm curious how much you thought about it, was the role of the media at the other end. If you put academics on one side, and then that's translated into policymakers, and then reports are written, and then something comes out at the end, and then there's public opinion to sort of understand these issues, understand the trade-offs that come from for instance, increasing energy efficiencies or understanding the long-term impacts of climate change. You know, the first mention that you make of the media is, I think, the first mention of climate change that you found, which was in 1953. And of course, as we sometimes do in the media when we aren't sure exactly what something is, that mention was 5 paragraphs buried in the page 11 of the Sunday section of the New York Times, or the education section. You know, and my first thought in reading that portion of your book was, gosh, Jay read a lot of newspapers to figure that out. But we go from that, and then there become periods of time where sort of the media notices this, right? How do you think that translated back? What was the feedback loop from kind of public awareness of this back into policymakers? And maybe that's, you know, that tells us a little bit about what happened in the 1980s around some of these coalitions starting to fall apart.
Well, if you go back and you look at the stories in the New York Times and Time Magazine, which both seem to have a number of reporters who are kind of fascinated by the climate issue, you could say the media did a good job of bringing it to the public's attention. I would say that, you know, if we look at how many news stories we're barraged with on a daily basis, the fact that something was in the newspaper doesn't necessarily mean that it clicked. And I think that's what happened. I say this about the Johnson administration. I said, if you go back in the Lyndon Johnson administration and you look for the climate stuff, there's a lot there. If you zoom out, as most historians would, Civil Rights Act, Medicare, Vietnam War, all these giant issues that are there, and at that point, climate change disappears. So climate change is competing for the public's attention. Now, one thing that I wish all of us, scientists, the media, and others had done better is pointing out the unique nature of climate change. The unique nature of climate change is carbon dioxide stays in the atmosphere for more than 100 years. And that change, and it's global. So it's a whole different mindset. And those basics were discussed in the early years, and now they're really not discussed as much as they should be. And I see a lot of discussions that I find very frustrating when this isn't repeated, because, you know, a lot of people are saying, well, we got to wait till we're more certain about the science. As Ravel said one time, actually in a National Academy of Sciences report in 1977, he says, if we wait for certainty, the die will have been cast. And the reason he said that was because of the long residence of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. Even methane, which doesn't stay up anywhere near as long as carbon dioxide, it's still up there for a goodly period of time. So I think it's been a challenge, but I can find a lot of good reporting there over the years, so I think that's encouraging too.
Yeah, I want to pause real quick. We will do some questions probably towards the end of this keynote, but there are QR codes, I think, on some of these boards. If you would like to submit a question, you know, I don't know, do whatever you have to do with the QR codes, and then type it in, and then we'll do that a little bit later. But just a reminder. So, like I said earlier, we have a presidential historian on stage. We just had an election, a pivotal one. So my first question is, these are global markets, energy markets, commodities markets. There is an impact that presidencies and administrations can have on public policy, but it is also within a broader perspective. So my question to you really is first off, what is kind of the level to which 4 years in office can change the direction of this?
Well, one thing I've learned, and I from my historical work, and I probably shouldn't say this since I sometimes use the title presidential historian, is I think the Senate is as important as the White House. One thing the Senate can filibuster. They have to pass treaties. We're basically in a situation where we would never be able to have a binding climate change treaty. You could never get the votes in the Senate. So the Senate is a really, really big deal. That being said, the Inflation Reduction Act is a really big deal. And you look at a lot of panels for these sessions here. The Inflation Reduction Act is a big deal. So that passed with, I think, 51 votes. And they had to use the Byrd rule, which avoided a filibuster. So it had to be tax-related or revenue-related, and then it didn't have to, you couldn't filibuster it. So for instance, the methane restriction, they couldn't regulate methane, but they could put a tax on it, because under the Byrd rule, you could do a tax, but you couldn't do regulation. So this was cobbled together, and it is so much money. The effect of it is muted by what I would call an excess of nationalism and protectionism, which is going to increase the cost of a lot of things. And that was true of both the last administration. It looks like it will be true of the new administration. So presidents make a big difference. I think the Inflation Reduction Act reflects that. And how they got, one of the mysteries is how they got Joe Manchin to vote for it. And then after it was done, why the environmentalists didn't treat Manchin as a hero. Somehow they were still mad at him, even though he was the swing vote to pass this very consequential bill. So presidents have a big, well, I would say the other thing that I think is appropriate to your question that I learned is presidential rhetoric makes a difference. How well can a president explain things to the American people? So Nixon gets the credit for passing the Clean Air Act, and he deserves it. But when I go back and read some of the Kennedy speeches and some of the things that Kennedy said about the environment, he sort of started to change public opinion about how we treat the environment. So I learned to maybe give Kennedy a little bit of credit too for the Clean Air Act because of the rhetorical contributions that he made. So that's another, the president has the bully pulpit to explain things to the public. And I'm not sure that any of our presidents have done a really good job of that.
What are you watching for in the next 4 years?
Well, I think in the United States, you know, what happens to the Inflation Reduction Act, what happens to methane. Methane to me has become a symbol. It's in everybody's economic interest to capture methane and use it as a fuel rather than vent it or flare it, where it is a potent greenhouse gas. I think a lot of oil companies and gas companies agree with that, but not all of them. And then automobile regulations and whether the Supreme Court is going to be hostile to environmental regulation or open to environmental regulation, because there's some that are passing under Biden. So the term momentum is very important in this. There's a political momentum and there's a technology momentum. And an investor doesn't really want to enter an environment, well, the incentives are coming and then they're going away and then they're coming back. That's not a good investment by environment. So my hope is that there is some stability to some of the incentive systems that have been put in place, but it's, I would prefer today not to maybe opine too much because we're still learning, but I do understand my responsibility to do so. We'll find out because I could argue both cases that if you combine tariffs, tough tariffs, and then you withdraw the incentives to American industry to build a strong American industry, where does that leave us? And we could be headed in that direction, and that would be a very dangerous direction to head. I mean, right now, the International Energy Agency says we're headed to 2.5 degrees Celsius. In the life of, say, my grandchildren. And for those of you who don't think in the metric system, 2.5 Celsius is 4.5 Fahrenheit. and it's not the same all over the world. It's different, and that creates additional problems. That will be a very tough world to deal with. It will create additional migration pressures, which were warned about back in the 1970s by scientists. So these next few years are going to make a big difference, and I can't say with certainty that I know how it's going to turn out.
How about the EIA? You ran the agency, the administration, excuse me, for 8 years during the Clinton years. Maybe first of all, walk everyone through what it is and what it does, and maybe let's start with that. And then maybe we can talk a little bit about that bureaucracy.
Well, after the Arab oil embargo and the increased clout of the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, they created the Department of Energy in 1977, and part of that was they created the Energy Information Administration. And until that time, a lot of data had been collected by the industry. Some of it was collected by the Interior Department. But they gave EIA a lot of independence. The administrator of EIA is the last sign-off on any EIA product. Now, that may sound logical, but that's not how the federal government works. In almost every agency, if you do a report or something, it goes out for interagency review. And this allows the White House, without often anybody knowing, to change the report. They can't change an EIA report. I have a few scars from telling them that. But so it has a lot of independence. So it collects data on how much petroleum is in storage, what prices are being charged, what reserves are. It collects the information. The information has to be submitted under law, but it's kept confidential. So our data records tend to be better than anybody else's. And there's been a strong record of impartiality, and I would believe high quality control. I would add to that, when I arrived, the Netscape browser had not been invented yet. And we went in very heavy in the digital revolution, and we were one of the first federal agencies to try to make everything available on the web. And we did it so fast that the Office of Management and Budget hadn't set up the rules yet on how to do a government website, which would have totally screwed it up. So by being so fast, we actually developed a very good website. And I think since that time, people have looked to EIA as a high-quality place to get information. Bill Maher last weekend had a bunch of data charts, and the only data chart that had a logo on it was EIA. At the time, we decided we were going to do a logo to give our data so people would know it come from us. A lot of consultants were getting rich using our data and putting their logo on it. That's of my career, that's the thing I'm probably the proudest of is what EI became at that time and continues to do as a good independent agency.
Okay, so what's the impact then if, I don't know, sometime next January, Elon Musk shows up with his kitchen sink to the front door of the EIA and says it's time to make this bureaucracy more efficient. There's too many people here. You know, your view of the EIA and what it does, you know, and I don't know really if there is sort of a level of criticism invade against it, but what's the impact of cuts there or of changes to how that bureaucracy works or a politicization of that?
Well, it depends on what he was suggesting. If I was there, for instance, when I was there, Secretary Hazel O'Leary, she came from the private sector, so she had all sorts of ideas to make us more efficient. And she thought that we all needed customer training like they did in the private sector. So the other assistant secretaries thought this is a terrible idea. And I said, Hazel, I'll take every spot. So I got 7 spots, and I sent 7 people to customer training. And then I set a rule that every cross-agency committee had to have at least 1 person on it who was trained in customer service. So I would leave open the idea that Elon Musk might have some good ideas that I would want to implement. On the other hand, there was a lot of arrogance in the industry. I remember I was there in the days where everybody worshiped Enron. And the Republicans and Democrats, man, Enron's the smartest company. You know, the book about Enron is the smartest guys in the world. I think it was written by some New York Wall Street Journal reporters. And so EIA would say something, and we were respected, but if something came from Enron, and I was sitting there, I said, I know about the investments they're making in India and what they're doing in these other places. I don't think there's any underlying value to this company. And it went bankrupt. So the fact that someone had been successful or was perceived as being successful in business wouldn't convince me just ipso facto that we would do it. And I got in a pinch 1 or 2 times, and so I used my ultimate weapon as I called up some people that wrote editorials for the newspaper and said, yeah, this is what has happened and why it's a bad idea. Didn't leak any confidential information. And got some really great editorials and brought it to people, and I would bring it to the attention of the congressional staff. A lot of congressional staff on both sides of the party, both parties, love the EIA data, and they would not take kindly to White House interference in this. Well, I'll just tell one story. One of the, when the Republicans were in charge of the Energy Committee, the chief of, and I was a Democratic appointee, the Republican head of the staff said to me, he said, Jay, don't ever bend to a request from us that's not appropriate, because if you do it for us, we know that you do it for the other guys. And once you break that trust, you've lost something that can't be replaced. And I think all my successors have followed that. In fact, some of them have used my example. There was a meeting at the White House near the end of my term where the Clinton administration was discussing firing me, which would have been a big mistake on their part. For they would have paid a price for that. But so that has to be cultivated. But I think there are enough editorial writers, there are enough staff in the Congress and other people that I think even Elon Musk would ultimately not be successful if he wanted to do something improper.
Yeah. What are the ways that that in your study of this, policymakers have been successful in nurturing new technologies? What is the way that they do that well?
Well, we have the great national labs. I mean, it used to be that industry had these great labs. Bell Labs, was a marvel, and Exxon for a long time had great labs. After a while, they said, well, it's not turning a profit, so it was cut way back. So it falls to the government. We have like the National Renewable Energy Lab out in Colorado, and Carter went out there early in his administration, and one of the scientists out there said, this was great, solar energies look like it's a hippie thing, and here the president came out here and told us our work was important. So I do think that people understand you need to invest in technology, but then you have to have a market pull. And a market pull to me is things like appliance efficiency standards, automobile efficiency standards, maybe some tax credits. I mean, we wouldn't have fracking as it is today if Carter hadn't set up a very generous subsidy for what at the time was called unconventional oil and gas, which meant fractured oil and gas. So those are the things that are I think kind of easy to do. And you have to be willing to invest. The government is a little bit like a venture capitalist. Not everything has to work. In the 2012 presidential election, solar, there's this big scandal, it's called Solyndra. Well, Solyndra had one approach, and another company had a different approach. They weren't both going to work. One of them was going to win, and the country would be the winner, whichever one it was. So Lindra went under. So there needs to be a sustained effort, and again, to me, in the book, I try to put an emphasis on automobile efficiency standards more than the international treaties. Everybody loves to go to these international conferences, and a few of them have done some good things, but it's really what the individual countries are willing to do, and that should be the criteria that we use to judge people.
Let's stop there, and maybe the moderator, if there have been any questions that have been submitted, can we read some of them out?
Yep, quite a few of questions have been submitted. First one is if we can touch on the early Republican support in the U.S. Congress for climate action and why they left the climate fold. And then are there any lessons that we can translate to today's political environment and working with a climate skeptical administration?
Well, back in those days, the politics was different. In California, there were a lot of pro-environment Republicans, and in New England, there were a lot of pro-environment Republicans. And in your oil and gas states, like the famous Hansen hearing in 1988 on climate change was before the Energy Committee. The chairman was J. Bennett Johnston from Louisiana. Lloyd Benson was, a defender of the oil and gas industry from Texas. So the whole, what's happened is New England has become almost solely Democratic, not 100%. So you don't, it's interesting that Joe Biden in 1972 defeated the Republican senator who was the lead on the Clean Air Act and who was a big supporter of climate action. So those kind of moderate people didn't get the credit they should have from the environmental groups, and so here we are today in a much more polarized environment. I don't know, we have dug ourselves into a pretty deep hole between gerrymandering, which encourages more polarization, and the polarization that would be there anyway. So, I think, again, you're going to have to look to Republicans perhaps from New York or California who may be more environmentally oriented. And if they do the right thing, give them the credit for doing it. Don't, continue to condemn them. So we need maybe a strong leader who can articulate the climate change issue better. One would think, in Florida, after all those hurricanes, that there would be a greater awareness of, hey, we're paying higher insurance rates from these hurricanes, and climate change is part of the reason for that. But I try to explain this, and I write op-eds and things like that. A lot of them are in Real Clear Energy if you read that. But there's a lot of explaining to do.
Next question is, when thinking about the long game, what fundamental races globally do we need to be mindful of for competition?
Well, China. I've spent some time in China, and with all due respect to this audience, which is superb, in China, there's a level of attention to talks I give about climate technology that I have not detected in this country. I've actually spoken to the Communist Party of China, and it was a last-minute invitation, and they were trying to figure out what are the technologies that are going to be the growth industry if we move to a greener world. Now, this was a little bit years back when our relationships were better, and the U.S. State Department was involved in the whole process. And by the end of it, I was meeting with the governor of the province, which was the 8th largest economy in the world. So I've written articles that said, do the China and the United States have a mutual death wish? And the reason for that is there are ways that China and the United States could cooperate if we were going to be rational people. And someday, someone's going to come along and do a study, was the human race a rational group of people? And if they want to go to war with each other, it's going to slow the climate solution problem very substantially. And I mean, there's a lot of problems on both sides. I mean, every lecture I gave in China, the first question was, why are you protecting intellectual property and copyrights on your technology when this technology could help us in reducing emissions? And the answer is, well, you stimulate more ingenuity and invention if you have some financial incentive. So they don't respect intellectual property very much. So that's a real problem. On the other hand, they can make stuff really cheap. And so they help us keep inflation down. They help us deal with the climate change problem more economically. So can we reach that? I don't know. I get kind of disturbed when I hear all this, you know, we have to hate the Chinese. I mean, we got issues with the Chinese. We don't agree on a lot of things. But boy, if we're going to solve a problem like climate change, we're going to have to cooperate more than we are at present.
Next question is, what problems could arise domestically and internationally if the U.S. withdraws from the Paris Accord Agreement?
Well, as I sort of suggested earlier, I don't think the big issue was whether we were going to sign or ratify the Kyoto Treaty or in and out of the Paris Agreement, which was, I think, 2015 and probably the most important of the recent agreements. It will be demoralizing for the world. You know, for countries that are trying to do things, it's going to be harder for them to politically to sell it to their people if the United States isn't viewed as cooperating. But I do think that the most important thing is for the United States to reduce emissions and say to people, hey, we did this and it was good for our economy. If you could do that, that would be more important than whether you signed on to the Paris Agreement or not. And Revell said this back in the 1980s. He was near his deathbed. I think it may have been the last article he ever wrote. And he said that the challenge is to deal with the climate problem in a way that protects people's quality of life. And that's still the challenge. And that can be done. Technology allows us to do that if we're smart about it. So I think that's where we are. I think we have to be smart. We have to be willing to compromise and understand that there's a sense of urgency, again, because I keep repeating the persistence of these greenhouse gases in the atmosphere.
Next question is asking about fusion, and is it worth pumping money into it?
Well, I'm not an all-of-the-above group, and I'm a most of the above group, and when it comes to energy, I'm willing to invest in things that I don't necessarily think will win. We have been investing in that. I wouldn't stop investing in it, but it wouldn't be my priority for new money.
Well, let me ask you a question then. Where would your priority be for new money then?
Well, the big issue right now is batteries. I wrote an article on this about 2 weeks ago for Real Clear Energy for those who are interested, and it was called The Electric Vehicle and Election Consequences. So this is a little bit like Wayne Gretzky said, you have to skate to not to where the puck is, but where it's going to be. So with the electric automobile, 250-mile range is not going to cut it for a lot of people, particularly if you live somewhere that can be hit by a hurricane, and I'm sure you all know the feeling. So I don't want a car that just has 250 miles range. 500, now I drive a plug-in hybrid vehicle. So, but there's no reason we can't have batteries with 400 or 450 or 500 mile range, and that will come because batteries are a little bit like solar has been. A lot of smart scientists are working on it, and there's a financial incentive for the private sector to want to make progress. And then batteries, there was an announcement a couple days ago I thought was hugely significant. Georgia Power announced that it was building a 65 megawatt battery farm, and they were going to build a lot more farms that were larger. Okay, so what can they do? One, it deals with the intermittency problem of wind and solar. But better than that, they can, in a sense, buy power when it's cheap and sell it when it's expensive. In other words, they can control their load better. Plus, the response time of these batteries is 0.2 seconds. One of the advantages of natural gas is the quick response time, so natural gas pairs pretty well with wind and solar. Batteries are better. So if you can imagine an improvement curve for batteries that sort of mimics what we've done with the photovoltaic cells, you're talking about a really big deal for the management of the electric grid, for automobiles and transportation. Now, I don't want to say that there's one magic bullet and there aren't 100 other technologies that we should be also being discussed. I'm not, we need all these things. But batteries, to me, is if you were going to focus on one thing, batteries right now are the dynamic determiner of how much progress we're going to make.
All right, next question is, can you talk about, sorry, I already asked that question. Next question is, in the absence of government focus on climate solutions during an administration, what is or what will be the role of the private sector to step in?
Well, you have several things going on. I mean, one, you have state governments. So you have California out there at the government level. In the private sector, I don't think the private sector likes being jerked around too much. So if they're planning on developing electric cars, I don't think they're going to stop developing them. Another thing that's out there is, it's very interesting what Bill Gates is doing, what Apple does, and other corporations. So if I'm, say, Apple, and energy is a fairly small part of my overall cost, I can say, I'm going to go net zero. And one way I might do net zero is carbon capture. And you say, well, carbon capture is too expensive. Yeah, it's too expensive, but they can afford it. and what an image booster that would be for Apple to say, we're going net zero, and we're not going to have an offset that's kind of flimsy, which a lot of the offsets are, and a real one where we have direct air climate capture. So that will be worth watching, and I think a lot of, particularly if you have a product that appeals to young people, you may be able to build more customer loyalty if you are perceived as a green company. I've been told by a lot of company executives that when they're trying to hire the best and the brightest of people coming out of school, they get asked, what is your climate policy? And there's competition for this talent. So that's another kind of leverage within the private sector space that can come into play.
I think that's about all the time we have. Jay, any closing thoughts?
Well, I would just say the bookstore downstairs has prominently displayed my book.
That's an important closing thought.
I will drop down there and sign any. I want to hear the next panel, so I'm going to run back up here too, but I'll run down there in case anybody wants to look at it. But I do think that those who are getting started on the issue or have been studying it for a long time will find things in that book that will be revelatory, and keep doing the homework. This is not the easiest issue in the world. It is, I think, a challenge for the human race kind of in general to do some great things. So I think if we approach it that way, we can treat it as a positive experience, and maybe some of the history background will help do that.
Jay Hakes, thank you very much.
Thank you.